There was a stretch of history when not a single human being on the face of the earth could read Egyptian writing. Not one. For 1,400 years, 0 people alive knew how to decode the script of one of the greatest civilizations that ever existed. And here's a detail you probably weren't expecting. To Cleopatra, the pyramids were already ancient ruins. The exact same way she feels like an impossibly distant figure to us, the pyramids felt like impossibly distant history to her, something from a past she couldn't even fully picture. We're talking about a civilization so old that 1,000 years before Christ was born, Egypt was already an ancient country. While Rome was still busy inventing a legend about twin babies raised by a wolf, the pyramids in Egypt were already a tourist attraction, and that ancient country eventually collapsed. It took its own writing system down with it. Today, we're following this 3,000-year-old nation from birth to death, start to finish. To understand how this country was born, you have to start with a river. Right through the middle of the African continent runs a river that cuts the map top to bottom, the Nile. And it's not just any river. The drive from New York to Los Angeles is roughly 2,800 miles. You'd need to string that distance together nearly 2 times over just to match the Nile's full length. The strip of land it waters covers an area larger than the entire state of Texas several times over, and this single river fed roughly 1/10 of the entire African continent. And yet, get close to the Nile and the landscape gets disorienting. On both sides of the river runs a narrow strip of green land. Grass grows, birds fly overhead, grain ripens in the sun. Walk just an hour away from that strip though, and the green vanishes without a trace. All that's left in front of you is red sand and wind. Life and death were separated by roughly an hour's walk. The ancient Egyptians gave these two lands names. The narrow green strip they called Kemet, the Black Land, because every year the river flooded and left behind rich black silt. The desert beyond it they called Deshret, the Red Land, the land of the dead. All of Egyptian civilization was born, raised, and thrived on that one narrow black strip. The secret was in the floods. Every summer the Nile overflowed its banks, water spread out on both sides, and when it receded, it left a fresh layer of black mud behind, like getting the best fertilizer on the planet delivered free to your entire neighborhood, once a year, without fail. Farmers just had to wait for the water to recede and scatter seed. No plowing required. And the way they predicted exactly when that flood would arrive was brilliant. At dawn, they'd look east, and when Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, rose again after months of being invisible, they knew the flood was coming within a month. No calendars, no clocks. They read the river's entire behavior off a single star. With land like that, people gather. Groups turn into villages. Villages grow into cities. But the Nile is so long that its upper reaches and lower reaches ended up as 2 entirely separate countries, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, living apart for centuries. Around 3100 BC, one single person swallowed both countries whole. His name was Narmer, and if you break the name down, it's honestly kind of funny. Nar means catfish, Mir means to strike. Literally, the catfish that strikes. That's not random. There's a species in the Nile called the electric catfish, capable of delivering a shock underwater more than double what comes out of a standard household outlet, enough to knock an adult flat instantly. To the people along the Nile, it was pure terror, an invisible force that could take down something far bigger than itself. The king borrowed that exact name as a statement of intent. He would bring everything under control using a force nobody could see coming. And he delivered. He marched an army down from Upper Egypt and conquered Lower Egypt. That was the moment the 2 countries became one. The Crown-Narmer War still exists in the historical record, a double crown combining Upper Egypt's white crown with Lower Egypt's red crown, one stacked on top of the other. From that point on, it became the symbol of every pharaoh who followed. So around 3100 BC, centered on a single river, the country that would outlast every other nation in history was born. And in that country, not long after, humanity would build one of its most unhinged structures ever. In the 27th century BC, in Saqqara, out in the middle of the desert, a man stood looking out at the horizon. His name was Imhotep, roughly the one who comes in peace, though what he actually pulled off was anything but. He was a priest, a statesman, and a physician, but none of that is why his name survived. It's because he had the borderline insane idea to pierce the sky with stone. Before him, Egyptian tombs were built from mud brick, flat and low, and they'd literally dissolve in the rain. Imhotep swapped that for stone, and he didn't settle for a single tomb. He stacked 6 levels into a 200-foot-tall step pyramid, roughly a 20-story building built out of solid stone 4,600 years ago. It was humanity's first large-scale stone structure, period. And this man wasn't even a king. He's the first non-royal person whose name survives anywhere in the historical record. The real obsession kicked in the next generation. There was a king named Sneferu who built not one, but 3 pyramids. One clearly wasn't enough for him. His first attempt at a place called Meidum saw its entire outer casing collapse one day after decades of work. Sneferu didn't quit. He started a second pyramid, but partway through construction, the ground itself started sinking. They'd been building at a steep 54-degree angle, and when the structure wouldn't hold, they abruptly bent it down to 43. That's why this pyramid still has such a strange shape. Steep at the bottom, gentle at the top, known today as the Bent Pyramid. Sneferu started a third, this time designed with a safe angle from the start, and finally pulled it off. 345 feet tall, humanity's first true properly shaped pyramid. And then his son completely blew past him. Khufu. This is the king behind what we now know as the Great Pyramid of Giza. 2.3 million stone blocks, roughly 6 million tons total, a base covering 10 football fields raised to the height of a 50-story building. It held the title of tallest man-made building on Earth for a staggering 3,800 years. A medieval English cathedral finally broke that record, but the storm knocked its spire clean off within about 200 years. The pyramid is still standing. And here's something worth flipping upside down. The idea that slaves built the pyramids. A lot of people just assume that's true, right? It's not. Archaeologists excavated the workers' village right next to the pyramids and found that these people drank beer 3 times a day, ate meat, and worked 3-month rotating shifts organized into teams of 20. The team names carved into the stone like graffiti are genuinely fun. Friends of Khufu, the Rowdy Gang, even the Drunkards of Menkaure. And when these workers died, they were buried inside the royal complex itself, an honor that would never have gone to a slave. In fact, the pyramid was way more than just a tomb. Building it meant organizing tens of thousands of people, cutting roads to haul stone, rationing food, managing shift schedules across years. So it wasn't the pyramid that built Egypt. The process of building it is what built the entire nation. And here's a detail that'll give you chills. Of Khufu, the king who left behind the single largest structure in human history, exactly one portrait of him survives. An ivory figurine the size of your thumb. He raised the biggest mountain of stone the world had ever seen, and his own face fits inside a single finger joint. The man who built the largest thing in history survives as the smallest. That dazzling age of pyramid building eventually crumbled. But what actually makes Egypt fascinating is what happens next. The Old Kingdom, the nation that built pyramids and held together for centuries, didn't fall to war or rebellion. It stopped raining. Around 2200 BC, the river that flooded like clockwork every summer simply stopped rising. That year and the years after. Rainfall coming down from the Ethiopian highlands cut off, and the Nile itself started drying up. Part of a mega drought stretching across the entire northern hemisphere, from the Mediterranean to India. Fields cracked open, crops died, people started starving, and the royal granaries turned out to be just as empty as everyone else's. Local governors, one after another, started turning their backs on the central government. I need to survive, so I'll take care of my own territory. The exact same Nile that had sustained this civilization brought down the entire Old Kingdom with a single drought. Egypt split apart and dragged through more than a century of civil war before finally reunifying, an era called the Middle Kingdom, when literature flourished and territory expanded down into Nubia. But that calm didn't last. Around 1650 BC, outsiders known as the Hyksos pushed in from the Levant and took over the entire Nile Delta, the first time in thousands of years that outsiders had seized Egyptian land. But that crisis ended up making Egypt stronger, because the Hyksos brought something Egypt had never had before: chariots and bronze weapons. In 1550 BC, a young king named Ahmose picked up those exact tools and turned around and drove them out, beating the enemy with the enemy's own technology. That's where the New Kingdom begins, the single most powerful era in all of Egyptian history. The most famous king of that new kingdom is Ramesses II, and the scale of what he pulled off borders on absurd. He sat on the throne for 66 years and fathered more than 100 children. He plastered monuments with his name across the entire country. At Abu Simbel, 4 colossal statues of his own face are carved directly into the rock, one of them as tall as a 7-story building. He fought a massive battle against the Hittites, a major superpower of the era, and the result was a draw. But what he did next was even more remarkable. He ended that war by signing history's first recorded peace treaty. And in the middle of this glittering new kingdom, something genuinely strange happens. Shortly before Ramesses II, a pharaoh named Akhenaten shows up and one day simply rejects every god Egypt had worshipped for thousands of years, declaring that only one is real: Aten, the sun disk. As far as the record shows, it's the first recorded attempt at monotheism in human history. Akhenaten doesn't stop there. He relocates the entire capital and even overhauls Egyptian art style. He tried to flip thousands of years of tradition on his own, and basically nobody was willing to go along with it. The moment he died, everything snapped back. Polytheism returned, the capital he'd built was abandoned, and his name was erased from the record. But because of that erasure, something interesting happened. Akhenaten had a son, Tutankhamun. He became king at 9 and died at 19, a young king who genuinely didn't accomplish much of anything. When his father's records were erased, his got erased right along with them, so later generations completely forgot where his tomb even was. That meant tomb robbers couldn't find it for thousands of years, and when the Englishman Howard Carter finally opened the entrance in 1922, the golden mask inside was still gleaming exactly as it had the day it was sealed shut. Because they tried to erase him, he ended up lasting forever. The New Kingdom was the most powerful era in Egypt's history. But during that peak of power, a final enemy showed up, and defeating it ended up sealing Egypt's fate in a way nobody could have predicted. Around 1177 BC, strange ships started showing up at the mouth of the Nile, dozens of them, shapes Egypt had never seen before. The people on board had brought women and children. This wasn't an invading army, but people who'd lost their homeland and were desperately searching for somewhere new to live. History only preserved one name for them, the Sea Peoples, and where exactly they came from is still a genuine mystery. Just how terrifying they were is measured by this. The Hittites, the massive empire Egypt had fought for centuries and finally signed a peace treaty with, vanished without a trace in front of them. Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece collapsed too, and Cyprus burned. After the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean fell one after another, the last one still standing was Egypt. Ramesses III stepped in with a brilliant strategy, luring the enemy fleet into the narrow channels at the Nile's mouth where he couldn't be outnumbered and lining both banks with archers. The moment enemy ships entered that channel, arrows rained down from both sides like a wall of light, while Egyptian warships blocked the front and forced close-quarters combat. It's considered history's first large-scale recorded naval battle. Egypt won, the only power that managed to stop the Sea Peoples who had just swallowed up every other great empire in the Mediterranean. A massive victory. But that victory turned out to be Egypt's last great moment. Fighting the war had emptied the treasury completely. Remember how, back in the pyramid building days, workers were given plenty of bread and beer? That money simply wasn't there anymore. The workers building the royal tombs went 2 months without getting paid, and starving, unable to take it anymore, they rose up, set down their tools, and sat down in front of the temple. It's recorded history's first documented labor strike, and it happened in Egypt. It was downhill from there. The country started fracturing from the inside, and the pace at which the pharaoh's crown changed hands kept speeding up. A Libyan-born soldier took the throne, got pushed out by a Nubian king who marched up from the south, and even that Nubian dynasty got shoved aside by the Assyrian army. A country that had once been the center of the world had turned into a chair anyone with enough muscle could sit down in. In 525 BC, the Persians arrive. There's a story attached to this. Supposedly, the Persian king Cambyses knew exactly where Egypt's weak spot was, that Egyptians worshipped cats as sacred animals, and had his soldiers strap cats to their shields. Egyptian archers reportedly couldn't bring themselves to fire, unwilling to risk harming a sacred creature. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great arrives, and this time things play out differently. He barely had to draw his sword. Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. That's how much they'd come to despise Persian rule. After Alexander died, one of his generals, Ptolemy, founded a new dynasty. The era of the Greek pharaohs began. The final ruler of that dynasty was Cleopatra. Say the name Cleopatra and your mind probably jumps straight to Rome's Caesar and Mark Antony, the two most powerful men in Rome at the time. Cleopatra allied herself with each of them in turn, trying to keep Egypt out from under Rome's thumb. But at the Battle of Actium, their combined fleet was crushed by Octavian. Not long after, Cleopatra died, the last pharaoh of Egyptian civilization. And here's something that puts all of this in perspective. From right now back to Cleopatra is roughly 2,000 years. But from Cleopatra back to when the pyramids were built is about 2,500 years. Cleopatra was living closer in time to your smartphone than she was to the construction of the pyramids. And there's something oddly satisfying about running down the list of every country that conquered Egypt over the centuries. The Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Every single one of those conquerors eventually fell too. Not one of them survived. While the nations that swallowed Egypt collapsed one after another, Egypt's pyramids are still standing. Before we wrap up, one last scene. In 394 AD, at the Temple of Philae, at Egypt's southernmost edge, a priest named Esmet Akom is carving letters into a stone wall, a scene depicting an offering to the goddess Isis. Every stroke he chisels out is the last breath of a writing system that had lived for 3,000 years. He had no idea, of course. He had no way of knowing that nobody after him would ever carve those letters again. After that day, hieroglyphics died. Nobody left who could read them. Nobody left who could write them. Thousands of temples still stood along the Nile, their walls packed with inscriptions, but a moment arrived where not a single human being anywhere on the planet could read a word of it. The pyramids were still standing. The Sphinx sat there half buried in sand. But nobody knew what any of it meant anymore, or who built it, or why. Those massive stone blocks sat in total silence for 1,400 years. In 1799, Napoleon's French army was stationed in Egypt. A soldier found a stone near a small village called Rosetta, at the mouth of the Nile. Carved into black basalt were 3 separate scripts, stacked densely on top of each other. At the top, hieroglyphics nobody could read. In the middle, Egyptian Demotic script. At the bottom, ancient Greek. The exact same text written out in 3 different scripts side by side. That stone made its way to France. Years later in Paris, a linguist named Jean-François Champollion, who'd been obsessed with that stone since he was practically a teenager, finally cracked it wide open. He read the Greek section first, then started hunting for the names of kings mentioned there within the hieroglyphics: Ptolemy, Rameses, Thutmose. Every time a name clicked into place, a door that had been sealed shut for 1,400 years creaked open a little further. History that had been sleeping started talking again. Pharaohs' names could finally be spoken out loud, war records could be read, even the graffiti the workers had scrawled on the stone got deciphered. A stone tomb had turned into a library. What actually killed this civilization wasn't the sword. Persia, Greece, and Rome all conquered Egypt, but none of them managed to end the civilization itself. What actually killed Egypt was forgetting. The moment nobody could read the writing anymore, everything vanished all at once. And what brought that civilization back to life was a single stone, dug up almost by accident in a forgotten village on the edge of Egypt. 5,000 years ago, the first people shaping mud by the banks of the Nile had no idea that what they were starting would last 3,000 years. And they had no way of knowing that what would eventually end it wasn't a sword, but time itself. The world you're standing on right now might work exactly the same way. Thousands of years from now, someone might dig up what we left behind and try to piece together what any of it meant. Tell me in the comments, if someone 3,000 years from now could only decipher one single message from us, what would you want it to be? And if digging up lost civilizations is your thing, hit subscribe. We're just getting started pulling these stories back out of the dark.